Well, here we are with another little video with some more photos. And the more I look, the more photos I find, and it's really something how usually I can remember why I took every photo that I took. And I'm going to start out talking about this old Pontiac that we worked on. And this thing came in there with the scraping noise. It wasn't running hot or anything, it just had a scraping noise. And so what we discovered was that the bearing in the water pump had gone bad, and it was basically this pulley right here was scraping on the housing, and that's because the bearing was bad and it was pulling it, the shaft wasn't running true, and so that pulley was scraping on the metal timing cover, which that basically is a timing cover there. And this is a 3.1. It's a kind of an unusual, I think in the opening statement I said it was a 2.8, but I believe it was a 3.1. But they're the same motor anyway, firing orders 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and all that. But anyway, this thing was making that scraping noise, so we popped a water pump on it right quick. And after that, we got it filled up and burped out and all that, got the air out of it. It was trying to overheat, and so it wasn't overheating when it came in, but it was overheating after we replaced the water pump. And so I got to looking and thinking about that. Well, the only thing we did, and we knew that we had all of the air burped out of it, the longer it ran, the hotter it would get. And so what in the world are we going to do about this? And so this thing, you might remember if you've done one of these, and most people have, the water pump's easy to change on one of these. It doesn't take but about 10 minutes to change it because it's just right up there in your face. Take the belt off, pop the pulley off, get to those screws, the bolt, clean your gasket. I always like to glue the gasket to the water pump instead of the timing cover or the block, depending on whatever the water pump connects to. Just simply because it makes more sense for the next person. If somebody else has to change a water pump later, they don't have to fight with scraping the gasket off the block that you glued to the block. And you may be the next person that does it, and so it's a good thing there. Well, one way or another, what we saw here, and what I realized as I got to thinking about this, was that timing cover, because of the cast iron impeller, which is really heavy duty on this thing, it had basically machined away the reaction surface behind there on the timing cover. I had another one of these engines sitting over there that was a junk engine against the wall, and so we went ahead and pulled the timing cover off of that one, and we laid them side by side on the bench just for the fun of it, and we got a little micrometer to work. Well, actually I took the water pump, a good water pump, and bolted it up to the old timing cover after I condemned the timing cover and all that. Let me go on to the next slide. See, we actually measured this. I don't really know how accurate that would be. It'll just kind of give you an idea, because the back side of that thing under there where the bottom part of the mic is, it could, for casting and all, it might not even be an accurate measurement. Just for the fun of it, we measured it. And, it's got like 50 thousandths of an inch there. All right, so let me back up to that other slide. Bolted it with the water pump bolted up to that timing cover. You can see a heck of a lot of space right here. Now, it doesn't look like that much, but I remembered one time back in 1984 when I was working at the Lincoln Mercury dealer over in the big town up the road, that I had this, the bookkeeper had a little Dodge Dart or something. It was some kind of little Dodge with a slant 6 engine in it. And it had a leaking water pump, and so we put a water pump on it, or they ordered me one from the local parts store. And on that one, the reaction surface was on the pump rather than, the impeller was flipped around backwards so that the blades on the impeller weren't pointing outward, they were pointing inward, instead of being pointing toward, they were pointing back toward the pump, is what it basically amounts to. And on that particular one, after I put the water pump on it, this guy right here was real fastidious, and he really liked to see his temperature gauge run down just about a quarter of the way up. Well, I like to see a temperature gauge, personally, I like to see it running up in the middle, because the vehicle's running warm enough to where it's going to keep the PCV steam, is going to steam the water out of there that you're making when you burn the gas and all that kind of thing. Well, the long and the short of it is, I pulled the water pump back off of his because it was running a little hotter than it had been before the water pump was changed, and he just absolutely rejected that out of hand. He wasn't putting up with it. I don't like that. I want something done about it, blah, 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 you know. Wouldn't have heard anything probably on that one. But what I found out on his was there was, whenever they manufactured the water pump, they didn't press the water pump impeller onto, there was like an interference fit on that shaft. They didn't press it on there far enough. I compared it with another new water pump of the same brand. And whenever that other new water pump came in, I actually used a feeler gauge, and there was about 50 thousandths of an inch difference between the second new water pump and the first one I had put on there. That was a little too much space between the impeller and the reaction surface. That's what had happened on this Pontiac. That cast iron impeller had machined that away. And so we wound up, when we replaced the timing cover with the one off of the junk engine that we had sitting against the wall over there, you know, had put gaskets and all behind that and put it all back together. He didn't want to spend money on a timing chain. It probably would have been a good job to do that, but we didn't do that. We just put, you know, buckle that thing up, put a new water pump on the replacement timing cover that had the pristine reaction surface, and his motor cooled down and he was in good shape. It was a really good learning experience for the students though, because you know, you wouldn't think that little bit of difference there would make that much difference. But whenever that pump is having to spin really close to that reaction surface to move that water, you know, it can't put up with a lot of extra space there that won't allow it to work right. So anyways. All right, that's the little measurement that we did. Oh, by the way, on another one of these, I had a student, and I says, you need to change the water pump out on this car. So he changed the water pump out real fast. I mean, it didn't take him hardly no time. And he was rubbing his hands together, and he says, all done, we're all finished and everything. I said, all we got to do is pour antifreeze in it. Well, when we poured the antifreeze in it, the antifreeze went everywhere. And I got my light and my camera and took a picture of what was going on, and you can see this sorry mess that he left here. Now, if it had been leaking just a little bit so that we didn't immediately notice it when we poured it in, he could have caused some sort of an engine overheating issue. But it's surprising, you know, you've got to have those gaskets. When I was scraping a gasket for a water pump or something like that, I always like to scrape it with something really, you know, they say you're not supposed to use a metal scraper on aluminum because you may scar it and all that. And you might if you're somebody that's, you know, would use a bulldozer to find a china cup. But I use, you know, razor blades and stuff like that to very carefully clean the gaskets off of these aluminum surfaces. And furthermore, I'll feel of it with my fingers, because you'll feel a place where if there's any of that gasket, you may not even be able to see it. Shine the light across it so it makes shadows. You can find it that way. But I feel of that thing with my fingers, and your fingers are typically sensitive enough where you can feel it if there's some piece of gasket still left there. And sometimes I would have a student that would scrape a gasket, and I'd go back and say, if you got a gasket scraped off there, good. Got to be perfectly flat. So I'd feel of it, and I'd find something. I said, you got to get that off of there. Oh, that's got to be off. And then I would follow up with some real fine sandpaper and sand it off. Then I would feel of it one more time, make sure it was perfectly smooth. And once again, I would glue the gasket to the water pump rather than gluing it to, and the same way when you put the thermostat in, if it's got a gasket instead of an O-ring, you just always glue the thing to the, you know, and I will tell you the truth, a lot of the times, if I could put that thing on there without using any kind of sealer or any kind of gasket glue, a lot of the times I would do that. If somebody put something like that 3M weather strip adhesive, you know, they got it, used to be, all of it used to be yellow, but now they're making it black and whatnot. If somebody put that stuff on there and they just put it on there and left a kind of a bump that dried up and got hard, that stuff can cause a leak if you don't use it right. And so, you know, of course, we had that gasket glue we used that was made by Ford. When I was at a Ford dealer, it was a brush in a can. And to start with, it was this brown gummy stuff. It looked like molasses. And then they changed it, and it was a real white milky stuff that you put on there. And it would be real watery, and then it would dry clear. And then when you put a gasket on there, you couldn't hardly even scrape it off. But I would make sure everything was clean a lot of the times. If I didn't use any, if I didn't have to hold the gasket in place, I wouldn't even use any kind of gasket sealer on either side of the gasket. And I kind of taught some of my early students that, you know, and one of them went to work at a shop, and the guy says, "Why did you teach them to put gasket sealer on these gaskets?" You know, it's a matter of personal preference. And that guy wanted to smear a whole bunch of it on both sides, and people put this silicone on there. and it squishes out. And if it squishes out in a place where balls of that silicone can get down there and clog things up, depending on what it is you're working on, then you've made trouble for yourself by using too much silicone. General Motors back in the 70s though, they used to use nothing but silicone for valve cover gaskets. You know, you ask for a valve cover gasket for some of those Oldsmobiles and Pontiacs and stuff, the parts guy at the counter would hand you a tube of silicone. Ford used silicone on oil pan gaskets that you put on there with a caulking gun, that gray stuff and all. And boy, did it ever hang on to that oil pan. When you were trying to get it off there, you just had to beat it off of there. One way or another, let's move on here. This right here was a cool little picture I took of a busted wire going to a wheel speed sensor. It had a code. And one of the things I always found interesting, even when I was using the Ford scan tools, like the IDS used to be the WDS. Whenever Ford first came out of it, with it, it was, I think, a little laptop based looking thing with no keyboard, and it had a had a 286 processor in it or something, but in a touch screen, and it was on a little stand where you'd put it to charge it and all that kind of stuff and update it. And I was in charge of making sure that thing was updated and all that. One way or another, we would basically, I had one time a vehicle, and it was a one of those little Ford Contours or something. Anyway, I was driving it, and it was throwing me codes for the wheel speed sensor on the right front, and I checked and checked and checked and couldn't find anything wrong over there, and it turned out it was reporting the wrong side. And I ran into that once on a Dodge Caravan too, I think. It was the scan tool I was using. I wasn't using on that one when I was at the college over there. We were using whatever, I think it may have been an OTC Genesis or something we were using, and it was reporting the wrong side, the wrong rear sensor. You know, and it didn't, I can't remember, it didn't have a code, but we were looking at it on the wheel speed, and it was, I mean, it should have had a code, but it didn't. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. Sometimes these things don't throw a code when they ought to, and I'll go into that a little deeper on another one I saw. Anyway, I sent it over there to my buddy's shop, and he plugged his DRB3 into it, and it reported the proper sensor. So anyway, if you're in a situation where where you're having trouble trying to figure out which sensor is which, don't assume it's giving you the information that the right, you know, if it's saying right rear, it may be left rear and vice versa, right front, left front, vice versa, and all that. So anyway, now this right here is very interesting. See, we've got a bearing, a hub bearing that was put on there, and it does not have a tone ring for the ABS sensor. This was on a 2004 Dodge Dakota. Okay, so it had a noisy bearing on the left front, as I remember it was left front, and we put that thing on there. Well, I ordered it from the parts store. They didn't ask me on the phone if it had ABS or not. All they did was they just threw it in threw me a box with a bearing hub in it. I didn't open it up and look at it. I told my students, I said, get that thing put on that truck and let's get it out of here. So they dutifully went over there. Doofy me trusted them to, you know, recognize that the two hubs didn't quite look alike. One of them had a tone wheel on it and the other one didn't. But they just did what I told them to do, like wooden-headed literalists, and they popped it on there, got it going. Noise was gone. They drove that truck for 2 full days before one of the people, it was a truck that belonged to the college, one of the people that was driving it got about halfway, well, she was going driving 40 miles, I think, to another town, and got about halfway up there, and the ABS light popped on about halfway up there. Why that thing didn't throw a code as soon as we drove it out of the shop is beyond me. But they drove it for 2 full days before they ever saw an ABS light. Anyway, when it came back and we investigated it, you know, it did throw a code for this sensor here, and it was because there was no tone ring on that wheel. I don't know why the parts store didn't ask me about it. Oil drain plugs. Everybody deals with oil drain plugs. If you start screwing an oil drain plug out with a wrench and it gets tight so that you have to use the wrench to take it all the way out, you need to replace the oil drain plug, and you need to inspect the pan too. You know, I had a whole container full of nothing but old oil drain plugs of all different things. You know, you pull that plug out and put it back in, pull it out, put it back in. It's kind of like lug nuts. The more you take them off and put them back on, the more the threads begin to stretch. And after a while, you know, you wind up with these, you need to replace it just on general principles. It doesn't cost that much. You know, if you buy one of these kits for changing the oil in some of these Volkswagens, they come with a brand new oil drain plug every time you buy an oil change kit, which is not really a bad idea. Almost nobody is going to replace the oil drain plug every time they change the oil, although you could. It would add $4 or $5 to the cost of the oil change, but you got to pull it out and put it back in there anyway. The steel oil drain, the steel oil pans that have that hardened nut tack welded on the inside that this thing screws into, that nut is a heck of a lot harder than these little old soft oil drain plugs. And so typically, whenever somebody has an oil drain plug that's stripped out, back in the day, I used to see a lot of people that would get these self-tapping oil drain plugs and just destroy the pan threads, putting one in there they didn't need. We had an oil drain, oil job one time that we were doing on some kind of a vehicle, and the oil drain plug would not come out. It turned round and round and round. So we wound up we fought with it for a while, and finally I sold the guy on an oil pan. Didn't cost all that much. Told him what the deal was. Your aluminum oil pans, the threads like to strip out in those sometimes. They'll usually have a fairly, deep bunch of threads in there for the oil drain plug. But if you have damaged threads in there, I have actually taken one of those kits where you put a bushing in a spark plug hole, because it's really close to the same size a lot of the time. And I would tap out, using that tap that you use for the spark plug hole. You got to be careful when you do it. And I would screw one of those steel inserts in there, really good and solid, and then stake it. It's a good idea to wash that oil out of there as best you can. Of course, it's always going to be trickling out of there. It's aggravating if you're trying to do something like this. But you need to do whatever you can to make sure that insert you put in there never comes out. You need to stake it good. You need to make sure, you got to be careful not to damage the sealing surface so that it doesn't always leak. But you can get an oil drain plug. It's got 1 1/4 thread pitch, and it's a 14mm thread size. And screw it in there and tighten it up, and then you fix that. The only problem is if somebody comes along behind you and tries to replace the oil drain plug with the original one with a 1 1/2 thread pitch, then they're going to have some issues with that. I have actually put a little note on the pan talking about that. Anyway, you don't ever hesitate to replace an oil drain plug if, it ought to screw out. When you break it loose, you ought to be able to screw it out with your hands. You ought to be able to screw it all the way back in real easy with your hands. If you can't, usually you just need to replace the oil drain plug. But that stretching of the threads on the plug is more likely to happen on an oil pan that's steel than it is to happen on an aluminum oil pan, although it can happen on either one. This right here, there was this navigator this lady had, and she worked at the college, and she got just outside the driveway, and it quit, and she was down there saying, well, my navigator quit. And I looked up the schematic, and that was one of the ones that had a fuel rail pressure sensor and electronically controlled fuel pump, that would, it's had a fuel pump control module. And so you can't, like I like to take the fuel pump relay out on a conventional system that doesn't use, of course, just about every vehicle out there, including the ones that I drive and my wife drives, have got a fuel pump control module on them nowadays. So they're not going to have a direct leg of the relay going all the way to the fuel pump so you can check it for a ground. But one way or another, what I discovered when I got in there was that this had burned up and come out of there, and it was dancing around, so I had to, seems to me like I replaced the pump on this one here for that, because there was not a good way to fix that, and so I went ahead and just put a pump on it. But somebody, I think, had pinched that and just tried to stick it back on there, but you're always going to wind up having, as it pulls the current from the pump, it's going to wind up heating that terminal up and all that kind of thing and coming loose again. Now this is something right here that smacked me around. Every time I turned around, I was raising something up that looked like it was made with these hubs like this, in case they decided to have four-wheel drive. They would have a hub like this on there. Even though it didn't have four-wheel drive, it would have a splined hole in the middle, and all of that was really good. Well, we wound up having to, let's see, there was a 2001 F-150 And what had happened with that one was the CV axle to I think it was the right front, had come out of the front differential. And so I says, well, you can't drive it bouncing around in there like that. And so for whatever reason, I decided to just remove that CV axle. And I says, you know, because we ought to be able to drive this thing without the CV axle. That's what the hub looks like on that Ford right there. That's the other side of it. You might notice that it looks a heck of a lot like this one right here that I've seen on Dodges and some other vehicles. And so I put that thing back together without the CV axle in it. And before I even went 100 yards on it, the wheel tried to come off because this bearing came apart. You know, and I said, well, this is not built apparently to run without that CV axle splined through there with that nut torque holding it all together. And so I was thinking, well, if that's the case, then this one right here must be made different from that, even though they looked alike. You know, this one here will go the whole life of the vehicle without ever coming apart. That one there didn't go 100 yards after I put it back together with a CV axle out of it. Just going to be a temporary thing anyway. Anyway, I had to dang it, bring that thing back up here and get it, you know, out there by the outside the shop and jack it up, put stands under it, replace that bearing hub and all that. It was great fun. But I learned that you don't ever trust that. You cannot drive one of these Fords. You know, you can't just assume that because you had seen one on a Dodge that was like that, that the Ford was going to work the same way. And the bearing hub is held together. It will come apart if you try to drive it without that CV axle in there. And so to finish what I was going to say, I took that CV axle apart and I put her, the splined outside part through there and torqued the nut to keep it together and all that until we could, you know, go back and fix it the right way. Now this right here was a fun little thing. I think I've mentioned this before, but probably not in this much detail. This lady had a 99, I think this is an 06 Pontiac, but she had a 99 Buick Park Avenue Ultra that was supercharged. And so she came in there, and this pulley right here, the bearing was gone in it, and so we needed to replace that pulley. Now this is on a 99 Buick Park Avenue Ultra. And instead of having a conventional bolt right there like you're seeing, this doggone thing had an Allen, like a T50 with a, you know. And so when we went to try to take it out, the boy, I told him, I says, take that bolt out of there and replace that idler. See, real easy. It's easy to get to, right in your face. And so when he went to pull it out of there, it turned out that the thing had a left-hand thread bolt in there. I looked in the shop manual. I couldn't find anywhere in any shop manual where it told me that that particular pulley had a left-hand thread bolt in it. And we wiped out the threads trying to take it out. When we found out what was going on, I just ran a helicoil tap through there and put a right-hand thread helicoil in it. Is there any reason why this thing needs to have a left-hand thread? Look, it spins this way. If it spins that way, why did it need a left-hand thread bolt in there? That didn't even make any sense. If the pulley had been spinning the opposite direction, I could have understood that. But as it turned out, we went ahead and we had to go in and fix the threads. But that's the thing, you can look at that and tell it's left-hand thread, and it had that, you know, Torx head on it and all that kind of stuff. But we put a bolt and a washer back in there. She never had any more trouble with it. And obviously it didn't need to be left-hand thread. Why did they do that? I don't get it. All right. Have you ever been in a situation where you're either, might have done this yourself, I mean, I remember eons ago, you know, I would get ahead of myself sometimes, but I go back in there where these students are putting the transmission back in, and you see this thing laying on the floor next to the converter. And you say, hey guys, I know you got it bolted up, you got your torque converter bolted up, you got your drive shaft in, but you're going to have to pull it all back apart because you left this out of there. Anyway, so that would make them groan and roll their eyes. It's like anything else, you know, when you're putting it all back together, you know, getting in a big hurry, and then you look over here on the bench and you see that important part that you cannot let it go without that, you know. So you got to pull it all back apart and put the piece back in there that you left out. Such is the way of mechanic work, you know. You got to pay attention to what you're doing. Now you might remember these DPFE sensors that have these little rubber hoses on them. They're high temperature silicone hoses, but those things can fail, and sometimes when they fail, so that they come unhooked from the DPFE sensor, if it's a plastic manifold like some of these have, and that thing is mounted by the manifold, that little those little hoses, exhaust will come blowing out of there and do a serious melt job on the on that manifold. Seen that 2 or 3 times, and it's not always this bad, but a lot of times you'll just have a fuel trim issue because it's burned a little hole in there or something. But there's always some exhaust. If it can find a way, it's going to, you know, if one of them hoses splits and comes off of there, comes off of that DPFE sensor, and that hot exhaust is pointing right at that plastic manifold, this one here would start up and die because it had such a massive air leak right there by that hole. Anyway, we had to put a upper intake on that one. There I was at the Power Stroke Rally. I drove that Pace truck at Indianapolis Raceway, Craftsman Truck Race, a couple of times. It wasn't just one Pace truck, there was like 30 of them. And they had, you know, I was up there as a journalist writing for Motor Age, and, you know, they would put me in one of those trucks, and I had to haul race car drivers around the track. Well, the thing about it is, whenever they put you out there on the track in that doggone truck, it's hot. Even though you're in Indianapolis, it's hot out there, and you're kind of wanting to run the air conditioner on the truck, but they said no, 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 you can't run the air conditioner on the truck while you're waiting, and you may be waiting an hour after you get lined up out there sitting in your truck. And so I said, if you run the air conditioner, the evaporator drain will drip water on the pavement, and it might cause one of the cars to spin out and crash, so you have to sit there and just be hot. And so we sat in the truck for an hour. I saw this guy selling bottles of water to the spectators on the other side of the fence, and I asked him, hey, give me one of them bottles of water. And so he handed it to me, and I opened it and took a drink of it, and I said, how much is this? And he said, $4.50. I said, good grief. You know, that's a lot, but I was willing to pay it because I was really hot that day. Anyway, I got another picture of me with you know, sitting in one of those trucks, but, you know, that was, you know, back in the mid-2000s when I was doing that. There's another picture of me in a different one of them trucks, actually sitting in the truck waiting to go. But anyway, that was the Craftsman Truck Race and all that. Now, if you know about your DLC connector, this is universal. You're going to have this on every DLC connector. These other pins can do various different things. But the only 2 pins you can take there are only 3. They're 4 and 5 are going to be grounds, and 16 is going to be hot. That's just the way it is. Usually pin 16 is connected with the horn button. The horn fuse. Not all the time, but a lot of times the horn fuse will be the circuit that powers up pin 16, which powers up your scan tool. I remember I had one of those one time that these grounds, one of these grounds was going to the battery, and it didn't have a good ground at the battery, and I told you about that on an Escort. I had the speedometer wouldn't work, and the scan tool wouldn't talk, and so I wound up having to fix that ground in the battery. But 4 and 5 and 16, these other ones, like I say, they got various different pin assignments for different things, but anyway, just remember that. This is something I've noticed several times. I don't know how many times you guys have noticed this, but you'll see people, their power windows died. They hadn't got around to getting them fixed, or they can't afford to get them fixed. I don't know what it is, but you pull up to the drive-thru, and somebody's going to have to open their door to do business at the drive-thru and to pay them for their food when they get there. And I've often made the remark that if you opened a shop in a town that had a lot of cars, and you put a competitive price out there on fixing power windows, you could probably do pretty doggone good just fixing power windows. That's just like if you have a shop that does nothing but brakes, you can do pretty good, because usually brakes are pretty easy to do and all that. But anyway, that's just a little comment that I had there. This one right here, this bolt that was supposed to take this exhaust out had a 15mm head on it, and so these knot heads, a lot of the times they get a impact wrench with an extension, and they don't quite get the socket on the bolt good enough, and it's kind of rusty anyway, and maybe it's lost a little bit of its dimensions because it's lost some rust, some material to rust. And so they start trying to take it out, and then they would round the darn thing off. And I was telling them, you know, if you feel something starting to round out or round off or something like that, stop trying to get it out. Come get me before you spin the thing and make it so round that nobody can do anything with it. Well, on this particular one here, I got an extension and I put a 9/16 wiggler on it, and I kind of got it started on this rounded off 15 millimeter bolt head, and I air hammered that sucker on there until it was on there good and solid like this. And I managed to screw that bolt out of there, and then we put a new bolt back in it when we went back in. I really despise the ones that General Motors put on some of their trucks where they had stainless steel exhaust studs and stainless steel nuts. If those things gall just as bad as the old ferrous metal ones, and it was the most aggravating thing in the world to try to get them out of there if they seized up and wouldn't come off, because you can't cut them off of there with a torch. I mean, I guess you could melt it off there, but you know, whenever you heat up stainless steel with a torch and pull the trigger, all it does is cool it off, because it doesn't oxidize like regular steel does. Anyway, it took 2 elephants to get that socket back off of that bolt. I took a picture of that before I did. Now this one scared the daylights out of me. This was a trainer vehicle. It was a 97 Pontiac Grand Prix with a 3.1 in it. And I had the engine running on that thing, about 250,000 miles on it. And I happened to look down there and see this hose had swelled up like a balloon. And this thing had a lot of hot water pressure on it. If that thing had split on this side and sprayed me all in my face, we're talking 2nd and 3rd degree burns. You know, you got to really, really, really pay attention to these hoses. That's the scariest one of those I ever saw. And I backed away from it when I spotted it. Of course, I took a picture of it, you know, like a deadhead. But I backed away from it, and then I went around there and shut it off, and we put a hose on this thing really quick. I had never noticed that before that moment when I happened to look down there and see that. It was like, oh my goodness, what if that was to spray water everywhere? You know, people get burned all the time by radiators. But if a hose busts and sprays it all over you, you know, it's kind of like, and I've done this more times than I should have. You hear a tick, tick, tick noise that you determine is a flywheel, and you get under there listening around and you're a little too close to the flywheel. Well, you know, sometimes those flywheels come apart when people are under there, and it just takes them out. You know, those flywheels can just explode and throw fragments everywhere like a bomb. So if you hear one that you feel like is a cracked flywheel, it probably won't blow up, but you need to treat it like it might. You know. This right here is something I promised you guys a couple of days ago. This is one of the engines that I saw on an engine stand in Billy Pilcher's shop. You can look up Pilcher's Automotive on the internet. He's not far from here. And this guy does some of the best machine shop work anywhere in this part of the country that I know about. And he builds these engines for boats and everything else. And these people around here that want specialty engines built for race cars and boats and all this kind of stuff, they pay this guy massive, massive amounts of money to build them these super high-powered, polished up engines. And I asked him about this valve cover. He said, no, I don't make those. He says, I have those made in California and they send them to me. So, you know, coming all the way across the country, they're shipping him valve covers they're making with his brand on them and all that. But if you want to have a good time, just look up Pilcher's Automotive. You'll be surprised what you see there. If you're a gearhead, you'll eat it for lunch. But that's all for today. I didn't want to keep going on. I had a bunch more pictures I could have showed you, but I figured this was enough. And I appreciate you guys tuning in, and I'll talk to you next time.